I wanted to quickly, first of all, create a page that allows me to overview how many loans we have issued, how many of those have defaulted, what's the recovery amount, how much we're potentially losing. Just by quick Google, I found out that average rate, or the assumption is that we recover about 45% of the loan. So we could keep that as a default value. We could do something also similar to what I did here. Is I created a recovery rate slider. And this is basically just to allow the user to choose how much we're actually recovering. So this is the total amount that we have issued to the defaulted loans. How I did the recovery rate. If you go to modeling, you can go to new parameter, numerical range. I called it recovery rate. You can see it right here. I'm just going to call it rec rate for now, so just so it creates something new. The data type is going to be a decimal number since I'm going to be working with percentages. Minimum is going to be 0, maximum is going to be 1 because it's a binary decimal value. Increments of 0.01, so 1% increments. You could also go with something like 0.1, meaning an increment of 10% all the time. It's completely up to you. And then, of course, there's some sort of a default value. Like I said, in my case, let's put it at 45%. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a new table right here. It gives you the rec rate and the value. This is the slider for it. You can see nothing happens right now because it's not associated with anything. We can also see it's a decimal number, which is not something I want. So I got to make sure that I adjust this into percentage. Makes more sense. Since I'm not going to be able to adjust part of the percentage, like additional decimal numbers, I can easily also say that there's not going to be any decimals. There's no reason to showcase anything that is not important, right? So just remove those decimals, 60% and whole number percentages, but the increment is 10%. I give this to the users and they come back to me and be like, it's good, but we usually go in increments of 5%. Well, it's a great thing that this was done with a formula. So I can just go ahead here, generate series, and this is all the same module that you had there. This is just the DAX formula for it. So this is the starting value, the maximum, and the increment. So if the increment is going to be 5%, I'm just going to say it's going to be 0.05%. Apply the changes, and now the user can move the slider with increments of 5%. Or 1%, whatever it is. It's completely up to you to just play around with these. Now, once you have this slider, you have to create a dynamic value. In order to create a dynamic value, I'm creating another measure. So for the measure, let's say I'm going to create exposure at default times the recovery rate. Recovery amount, let's call it test. I'm just going to say it's going to be recovery, sorry, not recovery, my mistake. Exposure at default times recovery rate, no, rec rate, I called it. So rec rate value, this is the value from the slider basically. And then I can go ahead, put it next to the exposure. So this is this number, just to check. We can say, usually I try to find some sort of a middle point, right? Where it's easy to understand whether it is a half or not, or you put it at 100% if it's allowed. In my case, it wasn't. So 95%, or that's the lowest, 0. 0 seems to be working. 10% usually is easy to kind of compare, seems to be working. So this allows the user to kind of play around with this. Loss potential was calculated as exposure to default minus recovery amount, right? Different parameters, switches, field parameters is something that I definitely recommend to learn. So since we had the exposure at default, what I also wanted to do is I wanted to be able to kind of split between them or choose what I want to focus on, whether I want to focus on all the loans that I have provided or the ones that have defaulted. The reason why I want to kind of separate between them is because it allows me to focus whether on the whole portfolio or the trouble cases, let's call it like that, right? So what I did here is I created a field parameter. A field parameter is basically a principle that allows you to switch between different values. And the way I did it is, since I'm changing the value, so in my case, for example, if I switch between them, you can see these numbers on the y-axis change. This completely rescales, kind of everything rescales, right? So whether all or just the defaulted ones. In order for that to work properly, and since it is a value, there's one important thing with field parameters, and that is that numerical field parameters need to be a measure. Otherwise, it's not going to work properly. So the way I did it is modeling, new parameter, fields. You can call it whatever you want. And in my case, I just had these two measures. I added them in, pressed create. I can quickly recreate it. That's going to give me a slicer. I can actually make this smaller so I have room to play with. So I have this slicer by default. I don't really want the user to be able to, for example, select both of them. Makes no sense. I also don't want them to be starting off or have a situation where none of them are selected. Also seems weird. So what you do is go into the formatting options, slicer settings, selection, and force a single selection. There is no way for the user to unselect everything or to select all of them. Just a single selection will suffice. Cool. Well, you can see also design-wise, we could have it basically as a radio button, or we can have it as tiles. The tiles are set through the styles. Here, you just switch to tile. And the tiles basically always try to adapt to available room. So more horizontal space, gonna have side by side. More vertical space, gonna have one on top of the other. Try not to create something like this though. Buttons that go to the sides, or if everything is now visible or very hard to read, try to avoid those scenarios. Ideally, I would probably do something like this as well in my case. I would try to have the text as a single row rather than one splitting in two rows, one having one row, just from a visual perspective.